You're 8 years old, and you just slammed your bedroom door so hard the picture frames rattled downstairs. Your mother's voice is muffled through the wood. Disappointed, exhausted, maybe crying. You press your back against the door and slide down until you're sitting on the floor. This is the third time this week. The third time you've been called difficult, stubborn, too much. But here's what they don't see in that closed-off room. You weren't just being defiant. You were protecting something. You see, there's a difference between a child who acts out because they can't regulate their emotions and a child who acts out because they're trying to regulate everyone else's. One is dysregulation. The other is something we've never had a word for. If you were that child, the one who felt everything too deeply, who saw through the pretenses, who couldn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, if you were the one who learned early that your sensitivity was too much and your truth-telling was disrespectful, this story is for you. Because what if I told you that your rebellion was actually the healthiest response to an unhealthy situation? And what if the very traits that made you difficult as a child are exactly what the world needs from you as an adult? If this is already stirring something in you, if you're recognizing yourself in this story, subscribe, because we're about to explore the hidden world of the sensitive child who learned to fight for their right to feel. Let's call them what they really were. The sensitive rebels. These weren't your typical problem children. These were the kids who felt everything. The tension in the room, the unspoken sadness, the pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Research by Dr. Elaine Aron shows that roughly 20% of children are born with highly sensitive nervous systems. They process sensory information more deeply, notice subtleties others miss, and feel emotions, both their own and others, more intensely. But here's where it gets complicated. When a highly sensitive child grows up in a family system that values conformity over authenticity, performance over truth, quiet over expression, that sensitivity becomes a problem to be solved. So the sensitive child learns to rebel, not because they want to be difficult, but because rebellion becomes their only path to psychological survival. Think about it. When your truth isn't welcome, rebellion becomes truth-telling. When your feelings aren't safe, acting out becomes emotional expression. When your needs aren't seen, demanding attention becomes the only way to be witnessed. But there's something we need to understand about the sensitive child's rebellion. It was never really about the rules they were breaking. It was about the rules that were breaking them. See, most family systems have invisible rules. Rules like don't feel too much, don't speak uncomfortable truths, don't need too much, don't be too much. For the sensitive child, these rules weren't just limiting, they were suffocating. So they rebelled against the diminishment. They fought for their right to feel deeply, to speak truthfully, to need authentically, to be fully. Dr. Gabor Mate explains that children face an impossible choice: attachment or authenticity. To maintain connection with their caregivers, they often sacrifice their authentic selves. But the sensitive rebels, they couldn't make that trade. Their authenticity wasn't negotiable. So they found a third way. They would fight for both. They would rebel to preserve their authenticity and demand to be loved for who they truly were. This is why their rebellion looked different. It wasn't destruction for destruction's sake, it was creation under impossible conditions. They were trying to build a life that had room for their full humanity. But here's what breaks my heart about this story. The sensitive rebels often won their authenticity, but at the cost of belonging. They preserved their souls, but they learned to associate their truest selves with isolation. And that's the wound that follows them into adulthood. If you were a sensitive rebel, you probably carried these patterns into your adult life. You might be the one who can't stand jobs that feel soulless, who walks away from relationships that require you to be smaller, who speaks the truths that make rooms uncomfortable, and people still call you difficult, too intense, hard to work with. But here's what they're really saying. You make it hard for us to stay unconscious. Because that's what sensitive rebels do. You hold up mirrors. You notice what others work hard not to notice. You feel what others have learned to numb.
Psychoanalyst Alice Miller wrote about how sensitive children become the family's emotional truth tellers. They carry the unexpressed feelings, the unacknowledged pain, the unspoken realities. But carrying everyone else's truth while having your own dismissed, that creates a particular kind of loneliness. It's the loneliness of the lighthouse keeper. You're doing essential work, warning others of danger, guiding them to safety, but you're doing it alone. And sometimes you start to wonder, is my sensitivity a gift or a burden? You might catch yourself thinking, maybe they were right. Maybe I am too much. This is the sensitive rebel's shadow, the place where preservation becomes prison. You preserved your authenticity, but you might have also preserved the isolation. You kept your ability to feel deeply, but you might have also kept the belief that deep feeling leads to rejection. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was the child who cried when her parents fought, even when they insisted they were just discussing. She was the one who noticed when her mother was sad, even behind the cheerful mask. When Sarah spoke up about what she saw and felt, she was told she was being dramatic. When she got overwhelmed by family gatherings, she was called antisocial. So Sarah learned to rebel quietly. She wrote poetry that her parents never read. She made art that expressed feelings her family couldn't handle. She created inner worlds that had room for her full emotional reality. By adolescence, her rebellion became more visible. She dyed her hair, chose friends her parents didn't understand, listened to music that matched her emotional intensity. "You're going through a phase," they said. But it wasn't a phase. It was Sarah finally having the courage to let her inner world be seen. Now, at 32, Sarah runs her own design studio. She's built a life that honors her creativity, her sensitivity, her need for authentic expression. But Sarah still struggles with intimate relationships, still finds herself drawn to partners who need her emotional intelligence but don't reciprocate it. Still catches herself thinking, maybe I really am too much. Sarah's story is the story of so many sensitive rebels. You succeed at building an authentic life, but you struggle to trust that authentic life is lovable. You become masterful at preserving your truth, but that same mastery makes it hard to believe someone could love you for that truth. Because the child who had to fight for their right to exist authentically becomes the adult who assumes they'll have to keep fighting. But what if the war is over?
Here's what I want every former sensitive rebel to understand. The strategies that protected you as a child might be the very strategies keeping you isolated as an adult. Your hypervigilance saved you then, but it might be exhausting you now. Your ability to be emotionally independent kept you safe, but it might be keeping love at arm's length. Dr. Stephen Porges teaches us that our nervous system has 3 primary states: social engagement, fight or flight, and shutdown.
Sensitive rebels often learn to live primarily in fight or flight, always ready to defend their authenticity. But your nervous system doesn't know the difference between past and present. It's still preparing for battles that ended decades ago. So the first invitation is this: what if you could let your nervous system know that the danger has passed? What if you could transition from the nervous system of a child under threat to the nervous system of an adult who has choices? This doesn't mean abandoning your discernment. It means updating your threat assessment system. The second invitation is about belonging. Many sensitive rebels learned that authenticity and belonging were mutually exclusive. You could have one or the other, but not both. But what if that was just the limitation of your childhood environment? What if there are communities, relationships, spaces where your depth is not just tolerated, but treasured? Research shows that children who feel mismatched with their family of origin often find their psychological tribe later in life, communities that share their values, sensitivity, and way of seeing the world. Your job isn't to become less sensitive. Your job is to find the people who understand that your sensitivity is a feature, not a bug. But here's the tricky part. You have to risk being seen first. You have to practice showing up as you are, not the armored version, not the performed version, the real version. And yes, some people won't understand. Some relationships won't survive your authenticity. But that's not because you're too much, it's because they're not your people. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you were the sensitive child who learned to rebel to survive, I want you to know something. Your rebellion wasn't a character flaw. It was character formation. Your sensitivity wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a gift waiting to be understood. Your inability to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, that was your integrity refusing to participate in collective denial. You weren't too much. The container was too small. And now you get to build containers that are worthy of your depth. You get to choose relationships that celebrate your authenticity instead of merely tolerating it. You get to use your finely tuned nervous system not just for protection, but for creation, for justice, for healing, for art. Studies show that highly sensitive people often become our culture's artists, therapists, leaders, and innovators. Your depth becomes humanity's compass. But perhaps most importantly, you get to give yourself what you needed as a child: unconditional acceptance for the fullness of who you are. I want to leave you with an invitation. Tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts, I want you to have a conversation with the part of you that's been protecting your authenticity all these years. Thank them. Honor them. Acknowledge the fierce love that kept your truth alive when the world wanted it buried. And then, gently, ask them, what would it feel like if we didn't have to fight anymore? What would it feel like if we could trust that there are people in the world who will love us for the depth of our feeling, not despite it? You might not have an answer right away. That's okay. Just ask the question. Let it percolate. Because the world needs your sensitivity. It needs your truth-telling. It needs your refusal to accept fine when things are not fine. But the world also needs you to receive love, to experience belonging, to know that your depth is not a burden to be managed, but a gift to be celebrated. Your rebellion preserved your soul. Now, let your vulnerability connect your soul to others who recognize its value. The lonely world of the rebellious child doesn't have to be the lonely world of the authentic adult. You fought for your right to feel deeply.
Now you get to discover the joy of sharing that feeling with people who understand its worth. Your inner child can finally rest. The war is over. You won. And now the real adventure begins. Not the adventure of protecting your authenticity, but the adventure of sharing it with a world that desperately needs what only you can offer. If this story has moved something in you, if you're ready to transform your rebellion into discernment, your protection into connection, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell because we're building a community of former rebels who are learning to trust that their depth is not just acceptable, it's essential. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their sensitivity isn't a flaw. Comment with your own story of sensitive rebellion. I read every single one, and your story might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear. And remember, you weren't too much then. You're not too much now. You were exactly right in exactly the wrong environment. Now you get to find or create the right environment for your truth. The sensitive rebels become the wise leaders. Your time is now.